I'd like to introduce today's speaker. By the way, if any of you have questions on Convocation, I'll be in the back after in the foyer. Come up and see me and we'll work things out. No longer will we be handing out blue cards. I said that last week and we still handed out blue cards, but we're not going to hand those out, so be sure to get your packets if you don't have a packet yet. For the third time in 4 years, the Salt Lake Tribune's Thomas Burr, on Tuesday evening, and this is August 7th, received the National Press Club's Washington Regional Reporting Award. A native of Salina, Utah, Burr and his parents, Jim and Ann, are here, as well as his sister Jan. Thanks for coming all the way from Salina. A native of Salina, Burr has worked the Tribune's two-person D.C. Bureau since 2005. He currently is chairman of the National Press Club's Board of Directors. I probably ought to say that he's also a graduate of my English 1010 class and was a star radio performer on The Cage when he was a student here at Snow College. First given in 1979, the Washington Regional Reporting Award honors the DC-based journalist who best provides a clear understanding of the issues and events relevant to the people back home. So his job, and he's been receiving awards for it, is to see what's going on in Washington, D.C., and then help those of us here in Utah understand it in Utahese. The title of it, he previously won the award in 2010 and 2011. The title of Thomas's talk today is "It Came from the Swamp: How Washington, D.C. Works." Actually, I think you should have put "doesn't work" lately. Ladies and gentlemen, from Washington, D.C., Tribune journalist Thomas Burr. Thanks.
Thank you. You okay? I know now to keep my cell phone away from Steve. It's a little scary. I kind of have to start this speech today with a bit of a confession. The Snow College Convocation series was the only class in college that I failed. That's right, I got an F. I skipped too many classes to try to burnish my journalism credentials, so it's kind of ironic that I'm here today to try to instill some wisdom on you. First off, don't skip class. But I'm here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about how Washington works, or as Steve mentioned, doesn't work. I've spent more than 8 years in the nation's capital. I met presidents, senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices, senior military and intelligence officials, and yes, even Bo the dog. I live 10 blocks from the U.S. Capitol. I have a seat in the Senate gallery and one in the White House briefing room. You may say that I have a front row view of the monster that Americans see as their federal government. And there's no question in my time the tone has got nastier, the fighting more brutal, and the gridlock even more gridlocky. Congress hasn't passed a budget by a regular process for more than 5 years. Even common sense proposals die a slow death. In fact, it seems these days that only thing Congress can do is name post offices. Did you even know post offices have names? It's the worst, is this the worst that it's ever been in the history of the United States? I'm asked that question all the time. Are our leaders so hell-bent on their ways and our government so jammed up that we'll never get anything done? Is that a bad thing? Let's talk about that in a minute. First, let me tell you about one of my favorite books. It's called It Came from the Swamp by Susan Trausch, where I got the name for my talk today. Let me read you part of the opening. In 1790, our forefathers looked out across a vast new nation and decided to build the capital of the United States in a swamp. Hard to believe, isn't it? There they were, surrounded by forests and mountains and lakes and several hundred square miles of prime oceanfront property, and they'd set up shop in a bog on the Potomac. How could this be? You may be asking yourself. These were bright guys who ran a terrific little revolution, wrote some great stuff, and they're sounding like my brother-in-law. The answer is simple. They took a vote. Anytime you get a bunch of politicians together for a vote, they're going to sound like your brother-in-law. They'll deliberate for hours, days, years, and then come up with a plan that will most likely put all of it in the middle of a stinking swamp. This is called compromise, mainly because the people involved are usually compromising themselves when they pass legislation. Washington, D.C. was forged in compromise and consequently never had a chance. Trash, who was a reporter for the Boston Globe back in the 1980s, before I'm guessing many of you were actually alive, notes in her book how she once visited the Treasury Department and saw a sign demanding precise payments, because the Treasury Department, the keeper of America's money, didn't give change. She noted that when you were going to visit Rayburn House Office Suite 2432, you should go to the 4th floor, because for some reason the second digit of the office suite was the floor it was on and not the first. Only in Washington, right? You see, Washington is a world in and unto itself, ran by folks who grew up thinking they were the smartest kids in the room, and even if they weren't, they were smart enough to convince everyone else in the room that they were the smartest kids in the room. That's not a knock on our leaders, that takes guts. It's the system our forefathers set up. You know, elect some people, ship them off to D.C., and they'll look after you. Then came the lobbyists, the bundlers, the wheelbarrows full of cash. There are special interests, political action committees, and think tanks. There's an association for everything. I bet you've never heard of the National Balloon Council, but someone really has to stick up for helium balloons. I have a friend who works for an association that represents associations. Is that a bad thing? Everyone deserves a pipeline to the top, right? Well, we'll get back to that too. Let me tell you what doesn't work in Washington: the trains. I'm not talking about the subway trains that ferry commuters underneath Washington. I'm talking about the trains that run from the Senate buildings to the Capitol and back. I bet you didn't know they had trains underneath the Capitol. And I bet you didn't also know that some of them look like, you know, those futuristic Disneyland things you might kind of find that have no driver at all, that just kind of close up shop. Those things really want on time. If the bell chimes and the doors start to close, don't try to, put your arm in front of it like an elevator door. One, you'll lose an arm and you'll still miss your ride. We wouldn't want a senator to be late for a vote. On the House side of the Capitol, the clocks are all synchronized, and they have their own bell system. The lights on the clocks and the bells tell members of Congress when a vote is happening and how much time they have to get to the floor to make that vote. Those clocks work well. So if we've got the trains that work well, and the clocks that work well, and the bells that work well, why can't we get the people to work well too? Perhaps they do. Think about that one for a minute. Well, I'll let you in on a few of Washington's secrets. No, these aren't the kind of Washington secrets that the NSA gets by tapping your phone. Though I can tell you I recently visited the headquarters of the National Security Agency. It's a tad unsettling to spend time interviewing officials at one of the nation's most secretive agencies. And this was before the whole Edward Snowden leaked a bunch of classified documents thing. A few days after our interviews, the National Security Agency emails me a transcript of our 4+ hours of conversations. My colleague who was with me at the time was completely unsettled by this transcript. He hadn't noticed that someone was standing there with a tape recorder. He thought they'd bugged the room and were listening to everything we were saying and transcribed it and were handing it out to everyone else in the government. I probably should have held back on that for a bit, but I cut him some slack. Back to the Washington secrets. I'm sure that all of you watch C-SPAN all the time, and when you're not watching C-SPAN, you're watching C-SPAN 2. Occasionally you're a little adventurous and you watch C-SPAN 8, the Ocho. Well, if you don't spend your time watching C-SPAN, you might think that members spend their time in the chambers debating for hours about the possible Syrian intervention, immigration reform, how much money to give the Defense Department next year. The cameras are always on when they're in session. They're capturing that speech by Congressman so-and-so on the need for sugarcane subsidies or against the sugarcane subsidies. But what you may not realize is that congressman is pretty much by himself, kind of like this, but without the audience. There's somebody, in the speaker's chair, a few aides milling around, but for the most part, it's an empty chamber. There's always one more guy, too, there. There's the guy who has to stand there and type up the congressman so-and-so's comments about sugarcane subsidies for the congressional records. Where are the member of Congress, you might ask? Why are they not standing there listening to what so-and-so has to say? Well, they have calls to donors to make. They have to meet with constituents. Sometimes they have to play poker on their cell phones during hearings. The congressional record is another one of those Washington secrets. Remember I mentioned the guy who has to stand there and type out everything the congressman so-and-so says? Well, there's a secret about that, and that's that you can always go back and change it, too. Every minute of every hour, there's someone in a typewriter-like thing who's typing up everything they say. And then the member of Congress can say, you know what? I didn't really like what I said there, so I'm going to go back and change it. Don't you just love Congress? Well, actually, let's say that truthfully. Not many people actually love Congress. A recent poll, 18% of Americans approve of Congress's job performance. That means there's less than 1 in 5 Americans that says, hey, Congress, good job. Another poll recently asked Americans whether they approved of Congress or a host of other things we usually hate. For the record, Americans gave higher approval ratings to head lice, cockroaches, and root canals than they did for Congress. Let's put this another way. There are Americans who would rather have a root canal while cockroaches crawled over them and suffer from head lice than say Congress is doing a good job. Wow. Well, if it's that bad, why don't we just throw those bums out? Here's the problem. People always want to throw the bums out of Congress, but they don't want to throw their bum out. Their congressman is great. He's not part of the problem. The congressman that represents Ephraim, Representative Chris Stewart, received 62% of the vote last year. Congressman Stewart, whose Air Force nickname was Stew Baby, by the way, if anyone wanted to know that, he gets 62% of the vote in November, and I'm fairly sure he still has a high approval rating. So why do people love Congressman Stewart but hate Congress as a whole? What if I told you there are plenty of people in all 435 House districts that say the same thing about their member and Congress as a whole? Love the member, hate the members. If you're a Republican, then you probably think the Democrats are a bunch of military-hating, nanny-state, gun control commies. If you're a Democrat, you might think Republicans are a bunch of rich people protecting gun and Bible-clinging hillbillies. Stereotypes are fun, right? Last year, this is kind of a fun fact. Last year, about 90% of voters in Sanpete County cast their ballot for Mitt Romney. In my home of the District of Columbia, 91% of voters backed President Barack Obama. If you're part of the majority here in Sanpete County, you might be thinking, those people who backed Obama are nuts. They're just wrong. They have no idea what they're talking about. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Well, let me ask you this. If you're right, then the other guy has to be wrong, right? If things are either right or wrong, correct? What if I told you that isn't the case? What if you can be right, the guy over there can be right, and that woman back there can be right, and you can all believe what you believe is right is actually right? Let's start with a good example. The color of the sky, right? Blue, correct? What if I say it's azure? What if I walk outside and, it's kind of cloudy, and I say it's slate or charcoal? So if, somebody says the sky is blue, and somebody says it's azure, and somebody says it's charcoal, is one of them right and one of them wrong? Or maybe we all have different perceptions of what color the sky is. There are shades of truth, and Washington lives in the shade. Okay, so we've established that two people can be completely different ideas, but still technically be right. But certainly there are common sense things that almost everyone can agree on. How about government waste? Everyone hates government waste. There's even a group in Washington called the Citizens Against Government Waste. But yes, even in waste, there are shades of right and wrong. You see, what one person sees as waste, another person sees as a valuable, good government program. Here's a fun one for you. During World War II, the US government decided to subsidize the production of mohair. It's kind of a type of goat hair fabric that our soldiers needed for their uniforms. Our soldiers, of course, haven't wore mohair uniforms since World War II. But that didn't stop Washington from sending subsidies to goat ranchers. The subsidies dried up in the mid-1990s, but were reinstated only a few years later after a big lobbying push from the goat farmers. Do we still subsidize mohair? Mohair? You bet. Do you know how many different police agencies there are in Washington? Well, beyond the city's Metropolitan Police Department, the Capitol Police, the Secret Service, the FBI Police, the National Park Police, there's also the National Cathedral Police. There's the Smithsonian Police, the Supreme Court Police, and not to be left out, the National Zoo has its own cops too. Each of these agencies has a different mission, though, and a different reason to exist. The Supreme Court has its own police, for example. Why? Well, they need their own police force because it's a completely separate branch of government. The Supreme Court can't rely on the Capitol Police for protection. What happens when the Supreme Court, really ticks off Congress and the Congress says, cool, well, we're just going to take our cops and go home? How about another government program called the Essential Air Service? It spends $170 million a year to make sure planes routinely fly into some airports, even if there are no passengers aboard. In one case, the federal government last year spent about $1.8 million to ensure a 19-passenger plane flew in and out of a rural area every day, even though about 2,700 people all year used it. That's a subsidy of $666 per passenger from your tax dollars. Now, what if I told you that subsidy is for the airport in Moab? Or the same program makes sure there's daily flights to Cedar City and Vernal and supports scores of jobs here in Utah and thousands nationwide. Now, is that a good government program or is that a bad one? Okay, how about the really, really ridiculous things that no one can justify? For example, that the federal government spends $25 billion a year, $25 billion a year, maintaining buildings that are unused or totally vacant. To my knowledge, there is no association for the support of vacant buildings. So why does that happen? Why can't Washington say, hey, why are we stuffing a bunch of money in the toilet and flushing it away? It's a little more complicated than that, as it usually is. The federal government has a process to sell its unused buildings, including making sure that there's no need for it. They want to make sure that before they let so-and-so buy it, that it actually is done, that the government has no need whatsoever in the future for it. It'd be a bad move, for example, to sell the building and then find out that the government actually needed it for a new post office it had just named. That argument, though, doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. It's not easy to write it on a sign or chant it at a rally. And we Americans love our bumper sticker slogans. Yes, we can. Change you can believe in. Country first. Believe in America. Our federal government has a budget of $3.8 trillion. Including our uniformed military, the U.S. government employs 4.4 million people. The number of services our government provides, the number of agencies, the programs, it's almost too many to count. But when we discuss the federal government, we whittle it down to make sure it fits in a 30-second soundbite for Fox News, or a headline, or a 140-character tweet. I often hear visitors talk about how Washington these days is worse than it's ever been in history. And when I hear that, I have to remind them of a few hundred years ago that a distant shirt-tail cousin of mine shot a man to death over a disagreement. His name was Aaron Burr, a one-time vice president who killed Alexander Hamilton, the former Treasury Secretary. How about the time in 1890 when a reporter shot a member of Congress over a dispute? Or a time when a congressman so upset with a senator walked onto the Senate floor and almost beat the man to death with a cane? Friends, it has been worse. Our members of Congress only bore each other to death these days. So you've heard me ramble on for a while, and now you're sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to my point, so you can get out and go have lunch. And let me say, whether the government works, maybe it doesn't work. Well, it does and it doesn't. Maybe that's a good thing. If Congress is stuck in gridlock and it can't seem to pass anything, maybe that means we don't end up seeing crazy bill after crazy bill become law. Maybe that means when anything passes, it's the result of a compromise. That means one side doesn't get everything it wanted. Maybe it keeps some power with the minority of Americans so the majority doesn't get stomped on all the time. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others." Maybe that was the idea. Washington may be broke, but maybe it wasn't meant to be perfect. And beyond all the special interests, the piles of campaign cash, the occasional corruption or sex scandal, and the Association for Associations, perhaps your Washington is doing what it's supposed to be doing, as aggravating as that's supposed to be. And that's all I have prepared for you, but I'm very happy to take some questions from you guys. I don't think we need a microphone. I could probably hear you guys, but feel free to just raise your hands if you have a question about Washington, journalism, anything's going on right now. I'm glad to try to answer or make it up as I go. Question there in the middle. Good question. So I got lucky in so many ways. I started working with the Salt Lake Tribune when I was here, filing a few little tidbits here and there and making like $25 for a day's work back that time. Then I went on to Southern Utah University, where I still continue to work for the Salt Lake Tribune. SUU is a great school. I will tell you a quick story about SUU. I know we're not there right now, but it is my alma mater as well. A few years back, I was part of what we call the White House pool duty. Every day, there's a group of reporters that follow the president around. And you can't have 300 reporters following him everywhere he goes, so they select a few people and re-rotate the service. So this happened my day. The President Bush was meeting with his cabinet in the cabinet room. And I walked in, and I look over, and I see Mike Leavitt, the former Utah governor, an SU grad. Right next to me is Scott Burns, who is the deputy drug czar, an SU grad, and me, an SU grad. And I'm looking around and thinking, beyond Harvard, beyond Yale, Southern Utah University, and Utah, for that matter, has more people represented in this room than any other state, any other school. It's kind of fun to say. That's not to say there are obviously amazing schools, and I root for the University of Utah when it comes to football. That was one of your questions, too. Can't just be one question. Over here. I thought you were going to ask about DC movies, which is going to be more fun to talk about, but hold on. My wife hates watching DC movies with me because I'm always correcting that, that's not close to that or that's not that over there. But my advice always when it comes to the news media is that you should never rely on one source. I find it amazing sometimes that somebody just watches MSNBC or just watches Fox News or just listens to Rush Limbaugh or just listens to Lawrence O'Donnell. You're never going to find out why you believe the way you believe unless you listen to the other side and understand the other side. So to answer your question, no, there's not one program. There's probably a dozen. I personally like to, get my news from, I watch CNN, I read, 4 or 5, 6, 7 papers a day. I try to, watch news programs, less commentary, because I don't necessarily need someone to tell me how to think. I want them to tell me facts that help me form my own mind what I want to think about. Question over here. How did I feel about Obama's address? So the president boxed himself in the corner pretty difficultly there with Syria. I think there's obviously no way to win kind of situation here, and you have to think about how. Let's say it this way. So when your guy's in the White House, it's easy to back their policies. When your guy isn't in the White House, it's easy to say whatever they're doing is just bad. It's quite fascinating to think if there was a President Mitt Romney and he was faced with this situation, would Republicans in Congress have reacted the same way if they felt that they needed to intervene because of the chemical warfare going on in Syria? I don't know. As it stands now, we may have a solution that involves Russia getting involved. The president certainly, had to change what he was going to do in the first place, and I'm sure in retrospect he probably wishes he spoke, a week earlier to try to make the case. So, right now we've punted that off, and I'm sure it will be back, like all things in Washington will be back at some point. You guys all want to get to lunch. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you over there. She asked about the Million Muslim March. So this is one of those things that it fits on a bumper sticker really easy, and I saw a lot of Facebook posts about it. So let's start with what it really is, and let's start with what the other response was. So there was an idea that they called originally the Million Muslim March. The idea was to bring people of Islamic belief to the United States Capitol to not necessarily protest, but rally for freedoms and for freedom of religion that we have here in America. The name sounded bad to some people. They thought, wow, what is this uprising happening? They're doing it on 9/11. They're trying to celebrate the death of thousands of Americans and a horrible tragedy that befell America. They changed the name, and I forget what it was called after that. I apologize. But this is something that, again, gets lost in the echo chamber of one side. Without knowing what exactly is going on, all you hear is, 1 million Muslims are marching on Washington. Well, that's not the case. What actually was happening was against a celebration of religious freedom and a call for tolerance among religions. So in response, there was a huge biker rally, people riding in from all over the country, and in many ways to commemorate 9/11, but also to counter this million-person march, whatever they named it after that. There was a lot of stuff that I hear, a lot of things I see. How come the mainstream media is not reporting on this? There are 2 million bikers in the National Mall. Why aren't you covering this? I can tell you, my wife was there yesterday. One, there were not 1 million Muslims on the mall. There were not 2 million bikers in the mall. There was a sparse group of Muslim Americans, I believe, doing a news conference at some point. There were, several thousand bikers who rode into D.C. and clogged traffic for a while, and they, rode around the mall because they couldn't get a permit. In many ways, there probably wasn't a lot of coverage because there weren't that many people. But if you watch on Facebook, and I'm sure you'll see this, 2 million bikers were there yesterday. Over here. She asked how growing up in Utah helped me for what I'm doing for a life in D.C. A good one is perspective. I think I talked in my speech a little bit about the idea that it's good to understand all sides of an issue. And there are a lot of times when I'm sitting there talking to someone, a good example, the Antiquities Act. So in Washington, still to this day, there's still talk that the president could use his unilateral authority to name another national monument. You guys are young, but you probably have heard of the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument. That was a really big deal in the 1990s. President Clinton named this monument in central Utah, but he didn't get any, heads up to anyone from Utah. He actually announced it at the Grand Canyon, didn't step foot in Utah. That ticked a lot of people off. To this day, it ticks a lot of people off. So it gives me a good perspective when I go back and I talk to people, and there are people from New York congressman who's a Democrat, who really wants to protect public lands, and he says, we really need to protect this area. I don't understand why those people in Utah don't want to protect it. And I have to say, well, don't you think they care about jobs? Don't you think they care about coal? Don't you think they care about some of the other reasons that they've been there forever and they've ridden these trails? It's perspective that guy may not have, but I have. And I think it also gives me perspective to say, okay, what do you guys want to hear? I don't think necessarily you guys are that involved in what's happening in Syria, but you might be interested in what's happening on student loans. So when it comes to that, I went to college here. I understand that. I went to college with student loans, and the only way I could go to college was with student loans. So when things like that are happening, am I doing my reporting? I want to make sure, what do people here in Utah need to know? What are they really interested in know? So that it does inform me in many ways, coming from a small town in Utah. I want to say Salina is one of those towns that still doesn't have a stoplight, which is fun now living in D.C. where I don't have a car and there's stoplights on either side of my house, and tons of people everywhere you go. So it's also a different transition, that's for sure. Question over here. He's essentially asking, how do we decide what's news? How do we come up with, what do we decide why to write this, not to write this, and how do we decide, how to look at things from different angles, essentially. Is that a good summation? Let me talk a couple things that drive me as a reporter. There's an old journalism saying that journalists exist to comfort the inflicted and inflict the comfortable. And what that means essentially is this. You guys are sitting here, you're thinking, life's pretty good. I'm a freshman, sophomore in college, I got a great future ahead of me. My job is to say, hey, look, your student loan rates may go up. This could be a problem. You may have a problem getting a job when you get out. I want to make sure you're aware of these facts so you don't run into them, like a brick wall. There's also the talk about comforting, our coverage of 9/11 and all the anniversaries. Try to make sure you know that, yes, tragedies happen, but look at the response by the community to build this memorial or to make sure that this widow of this event is taken care of. So those are kind of two mantras. And feeding into that a lot of times, a great saying that an editor once told me is not to try to be unbiased, but try to be fair. I'll try to explain that one too. There's a lot of biases we all have. One, I'm an American. I love the great state of Utah. So when I write a story that may, say I'm dealing with intelligence documents, that may not make America look, or the U.S. government look very good. Is my job to make America look very good, or is my job to make sure that readers are informed about what's happening? And if their government had done something wrong, that they know that they can correct it. I think we all have to live with biases we have, but I want to be fair. And that's not to say that if I say the sky is blue and you say it is red and we're all going to die, that I should give you the same amount of space in the story that says we're all going to die, it's red, and the same sky is blue down here, because I want to be fair. I think there's a part of accuracy we have to be too. All sides are represented. There are not two sides to a story. There may be 5, there may be 6. I'm not sure I got to the heart of your question, but I appreciate you asking me about that. Steve? Well, thank you. His question is on, what, I think you all heard that. His question is, what can you actually do to make a change? We all know that we hear something, we get aggravated about what's going on somewhere in some issue of the federal government or the state government or local government, and sometimes we feel like we never actually get to make anything happen. I'll say a few things. First off, vote. It's really hard to say, but you as young Americans are in the voter bloc that votes the least. And it's really sad to see that. And I don't know, maybe it's because you don't feel like it's something you really care about, or that both candidates are horrible people, or that maybe these issues aren't something you really want to pay attention to until you graduate. But voting is a good start, because unless you vote, then it's hard for us to know, like, well, did they really represent the people as Utahns, or do they just represent those who decided to turn out on November 2nd on that Tuesday, during the day? And Professor Peterson, I should call you Professor, I'm sorry. One person sometimes can't make a difference. But you, that person over there, a couple of people over there, this entire audience right now, you can make a difference. It's not the one phone call to Senator Orrin Hatch's office that may make a difference. It's the 3,000 phone calls that he has to answer to at some point. It's the calls to Utah's office. It's the calls to this member of Congress. It's you showing up in Washington or sending a bundle of letters that say, I am really concerned about this. Can you please answer me? Congressman Bishop represents northern Utah. Some of you are probably from there. I respect to so much degree what he does with the constituent mail. Agree with him politically or not, the man answers every single letter, he answers every single phone call. He'll spend till midnight or so in his office calling people back to explain, why he's voting one way or why he's not voting another way. I think they are representative. That's not to say if you're a Democrat in Utah, Senator Mike Lee is going to vote with you 98% of the time. But, you can always make your voice heard. At least that's a start. And maybe it takes a room like this and a room like this at SUU and a room like this at UVU to start making more of a difference. But, it starts with one person standing up and asking a question and somebody else saying, I agree, and then getting together and making that movement go. Sorry, way in the back. Thank you. Yes, your question is about the president and when it comes down to coal mining. I'm obviously not here to represent the administration or speak for them in any ways. I don't think there's any proposal out there whatsoever that the president has floated to shut down coal mines. There are certainly members of Congress who are not the biggest coal supporters. My brother-in-law is also a coal miner, for the record. So yeah, I understand those issues. I think you have to understand too, to make sure you look at other sources. The president's issue mainly has been for alternative, fuels, fuel efficiency, things like solar panels, which are great too, but he's also supported coal. Even during the last campaign, he talked about clean coal. His efforts on climate change kind of stopped in 2009. I don't know if that's coming back or not. But for the most part, you know, we as Americans are always fearful of big change like that, but coal is a very needed quantity in America and a very needed quantity internationally. So I don't think you should expect the coal mines to shut down anytime soon. You know, maybe minor changes, some regulations, but I'm sure that coal will still be a huge resource this country will tap. So if I'm missing your hand, just scream out at me. I can't see any. Okay, I think you guys are ready to go to lunch. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.